Statistically, this was the most successful Everest season ever. I think more people reached the summit than on any previous year, partly down to more climbers, but also the fact that the weather was ideal for a large period in the middle of May. The weather improved around 14th, 15th May, the summit ropes were put in, and then for the 10 following days there were low winds, little cloud, and people were able to summit consecutively for 10 days, which I don't think has happened in the recent past.
Okay, one thing people have talked about this year is the icefall, the Khumbu Icefall, and how difficult that was. I heard that the route is more through more of the central part of the icefall, and then maybe it's becoming more difficult. Would you say that's the case?
The route changes every year, and there's a number of different things contribute to the difficulty. There were certainly fewer ladders in the icefall than in previous seasons, which makes travel a bit quicker. However, when you get to the top, just for the final kilometre into Camp 1, there are some really quite big crevasses opening, and so the route either has to weave between them or climb up and down them. The route is probably less threatened from icefall from either the right or the left side than in previous seasons, because it is quite central, but there is still it weaves between quite a few towers which themselves are unstable. I don't think the overall difficulty or danger of the icefall has changed massively. It's just that these features are different from year to year.
And I mean, something people are always interested in, and certainly talked about prior to this season, are the number of climbers and Sherpas on the south side of the mountain. That obviously has an impact if you're moving through the icefall, and then of course higher on the mountain on summit day. How was it this season with crowding, would you say?
I think on all the lower sections, moving between base camp and Camp 1, Camp 2 and Camp 3, it's possible to avoid a lot of people by travelling at slightly unusual times. We tended to travel a bit earlier than most people, partly to avoid the sun and partly to avoid the crowds. And that works for the vast majority of the expedition until you get to the summit push. If there's a number of climbers aiming for the same summit day, when you move from Camp 3 to Camp 4 and then Camp 4 to the summit, they are all going to be together. This year we hope to go to the summit on a relatively quiet day, but weather and whatever pushed us a day later, and we ended up being on the busiest day ever from the south side, and I believe 140 people went to the summit that day.
Yeah, so originally I think you were on a schedule, weren't you, to go from Camp 2 to Camp 3 and the South Col Camp 4 as normal, but you set off from Camp 3 on the first attempt, and the weather actually deteriorated. It was a lot poorer than the forecast. Can you describe how bad it was that day?
Yes, we packed up and left Camp 3. It was a little cloudy, a little windy, but fine. A few hours later, a few hundred metres higher, visibility was down to 10 or 20 metres. The wind was quite strong, maybe 25, 30 knots, gusting above that. There were a large number of people, 60, 70 people had set out. When you're in a line behind other people and there is a fixed rope, it gives an impression of security, safety in numbers. But as the conditions got worse, I just started asking myself, on any other mountain in the world, would I be carrying on in these weather conditions? And the answer was clearly no. So the fact that there was a fixed rope, there were many other people in front of me. Several other people chose to keep going, but I decided that it just was not a safe condition to be out in what could be a long, 8 or 10 hours. And we were moving to a camp that was not set up. We had been going with the intention of erecting the tents at Camp 4 and sleeping there, and the thought of arriving at the South Col in winds of potentially above 40 knots in a snowstorm after a 10-hour day and not having tents set up it struck me as unsafe, so we went back down to Camp 3.
Okay, and then you had an extra night at Camp 3, and then the following day moved up to occupy, or set up and occupy Camp 4 on the South Col. And then, of course, you set off that later that night, so you only had a few hours to rest and recover there before the long summit day. Can you describe? I mean, you've already said it was one of the busiest summit days, or the busiest summit day on Everest. Can you describe sort of some aspects of that? I mean, you know, how often did you eat or drink? Just give a bit of an impression of the climb on summit day.
It was really less than ideal. You know, we had aimed to go to Camp 4 on the 14th with the aim of summiting on the 15th, but because of the poor weather, all the people who were aiming to summit on the 15th and all the people who were aiming to summit on the 16th ended up being pushed onto the one day. So that's why it was so busy. Normally, I would like to arrive at the South Col as soon after lunch as possible, 1 or 2 o'clock, in order to have a reasonable rest before setting off. For a number of reasons, partly people in the route, deep snow, we ended up not getting into Camp 4 till much later in the afternoon. Really far from ideal, but I knew that we'd quite a strong team. We'd worked quite hard in the previous weeks. I told them from the beginning always that we were hoping to get an easy summit day, but we were going to train in order to cope with a difficult summit day. And so even though we only had a few hours fairly uncomfortable partial rest at the South Col, with not really as much to eat and drink as we would have preferred, several other parties set off around 9 or 10 o'clock. We waited until after 11 just in order to give us a little bit of extra rest. Reading different people's accounts of climbing Everest, some of them get quite straightforward summit days and others have to cope with more difficult ones. And although most of my previous difficult summits have been because of the weather, I think the main thing that made this year challenging were the number of other climbers and the complications that creates in terms of crowding.
And we've seen post earthquake, of course, you know, it's been widely reported that the Hillary Step, you know, has actually collapsed and it's more of a ramp feature now. There's quite a lot of snow this spring. Has that made it less of a bottleneck, or has it really affected those last few meters to the summit?
Well, this year was of my 12 Everest expeditions, this year was by far there was more snow than ever before. For people breaking trail, obviously made things more difficult, but for most people that made several sections of the route easier than normal, from the South Col to the balcony and on to the South Summit. It's usually quite a bit of climbing over rock. It was almost entirely snow, which makes it easier. Similarly, from the South Summit to the main summit, there are often some quite awkward slanting ledges to cross, and these were mostly buried under snow. However, the Hillary Step question, in all the years since the earthquake, the years since the earthquake have generally been quite snowy, and my view is that the actual rock feature of the Hillary Step has been covered with snow for 3 years, and until we get a dry season when all that snow is gone, we won't be able to say if the actual rock feature has changed. I think there's a good chance that the traditional Hillary Step that everybody knows, with lots of old fixed rope hanging on it, is still there, but this year it was under 2 or 3 meters of snow. It is possible that when that snow melts, the rock feature underneath may have been changed by the earthquake, but until that snow's gone, it is not possible to say. I do think a few days after our ascent, the snow on the Hillary Step was easier, but when we were there, it was more difficult. The snow made it a more difficult climb than the rock, because with more and more people, it's vertical, and with more and more people climbing, it become undercut. So essentially it was almost an overhanging snow, admittedly only 3-4 meters high, but an overhanging snow feature when we were there. But I do think after a few more days of traffic, it became more ramp-like. The thing a fixed rope hanging on rock is always going to hang on the surface, but a fixed rope coming down vertical, unconsolidated snow, the rope cuts into the snow and it becomes quite difficult to work with.
You know, of course, we couldn't climb Everest each season without the support we have from our Sherpas. Certainly some of the team members who were successful this spring commented to me that, you know, our Sherpas were amazingly strong and supportive, you know, especially on Summit Day. I mean, what would you say in terms of, you know, the support we had this season?
No, Pemshiri, our Sirdar, is one of the most experienced, although he's relatively young compared to other Sherpas that have been on Everest as many times, did a really good job of planning and organising the logistic aspect of the Sherpa support on the mountain, and also led his team of 3, one of whom is his brother, very well. You know, in the early part of the expedition, while I assisted the climbers to acclimatise, Pem was organising the Sherpas to move all the equipment in place on the mountain, and then when it came to Summit Day, they climbed with us 1-to-1, carrying the spare oxygen, and just help. You know, people had minor difficulties with gloves and face masks and whatever, and the Sherpas are very attentive to help people overcome these difficulties in a pretty harsh, hostile environment.
This was your 9th summit, David. It's one of the toughest summits, do you think, this year?
Yeah, that's it. 2016 was really pretty difficult because we summited in stormy weather. It was windy on the summit ridge, but there were very few other climbers around. This year was challenging, even though the weather, if anything, the weather was too hot. We were overdressed, and with a down suit on, it's difficult to change that. But the challenge really became the number of other people who were moving relatively slowly, and therefore it was my longest summit day. You know, we were out for almost 20 hours, whereas with normal conditions we've done it in 14 or so. So they're all challenging in different ways. It's the first time I've been too hot on summit day, and it's the first time I've had to cope with that many other climbers on the mountain.
Well, thanks very much, David, for certainly getting the Jagged Globe team up and down safely once again this season, and for giving us a bit more of an insight into 2018 and what happened on the mountain. Thank you.
And we're looking forward to going back next year.